Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the third of three pre-conference presentations for the Lacan Clinic and Culture conference that we're hosting at Duquesne University in 2 weeks from today. It's nice to see some familiar faces. I note that a couple of people have been to a series of these talks, so a very warm welcome to everyone. If you are planning on coming to the conference, please make sure you've registered. I said that just because we want to make sure we can pay for food for everyone. And yeah, let me now pass over to John, just to say we're all very excited about the event that's about to happen. John Delalio, who is one of the co-organizers of the conference, will be the chair for this session, and I'm going to pass over to him right now.
Great, thanks, Derek. And yes, thank you all for coming. This is really exciting and glad to have you all here. It's my pleasure to introduce Adrian Johnston for our pre-conference seminar today for the Lacan Clinic Culture event that we're throwing at Duquesne, and this is the last of our online series here. Adrian Johnston is Distinguished Professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of New Mexico at Albuquerque and a faculty member at the Emory Psychoanalytic Institute in Atlanta. He's the author of several books, Time Driven, Metapsychology and the Splitting of the Drive, Zizek's Ontology, Adieu, Zizek and Political Transformations, and Prolegomena to Any Future Materialism, Volume 1, all published by Northwestern University Press. He's the author of Adventures in Transcendental Materialism and the co-author with Catherine Malibu of Self and Emotional Life, some of which material will be the basis for today's pre-conference seminar. His most recent books are Irrepressible Truth on Lacan's The Freudian Thing, A New German Idealism, Hegel, Zizek, and Dialectical Materialism, and Prolegomena to Any Future Materialism, Volume 2, also published, latter published with Northwestern University Press. Finally, he has two current new book projects under review, Infinite Greed, Money, Marxism, Psychoanalysis, and with co-author Lorenzo Chiesa, God is Undead, Psychoanalysis Between Agnosticism and Atheism. With Todd McGowan and Slavoj Žižek, he's the co-editor of the book series Diuresis at Northwestern University Press. Professor Johnston, we're incredibly grateful and excited for your presentation today, and we're looking forward to the discussion. So we will have about an hour of Adrian speaking, and then we'll take about a 10-minute break, rest our eyes from Zoom and everything, and we'll come back. If you have any questions as they come up during the talk, please put them in the chat. My colleague Mason and I will collect the questions, and then we'll ask them in the second half of the session and open up some room for discussion. So with that, let's begin.
Well, to begin with, I would like to thank John, Derek, and the other organizers who have put in so much effort to making all of these online pre-conference events included possible. And I am, needless to say, really looking forward to seeing at least a good number of you, if not all of you, in person in a couple of weeks in Pittsburgh when we gather for the conference itself. And in conferring with Derek and John about both the pre-conference workshops and the conference and what might be best for me to present, it has ended up being that two of the books John mentioned, the two that are in it's different stages of the publication process that haven't appeared yet, the first, Infinite Greed, Money, Marxism, and Psychoanalysis, and the second, co-authored with Lorenzo Chiesa, God is Undead, Psychoanalysis Between Agnosticism and Atheism. It's ended up that I'll be presenting material from each of those book projects as my two talks in Pittsburgh. And for this event, this online workshop that we're doing now, it was conveyed to me that perhaps my work on Lacan, neuropsychoanalysis, and the metapsychology of affect as per self and emotional life would be perhaps the most suitable thing, especially in light of the clinical component of the conference and the interest in that side of Lacan as being represented as part of this event. So for me, the material that I will be presenting, that I'm drawing from Self and Emotional Life to, as the basis for this presentation, that in this work, I was able to, for myself, directly bring together a number of my areas of interest, starting with at the most general level, as a philosopher, my concerns with materialism and with basically ontological foundation for, not only philosophy, but also for psychoanalysis. And, tied to this, issues having to do with naturalism and what we might say, paraphrasing Freud, would be naturalism and its discontents, and especially, how these issues, apropos naturalism or its, various alternatives to it, feature within Lacanian thinking, and then also, of course, in terms of materialism and naturalism, possible linkages between neuropsychoanalysis on the one hand and Lacanian theory on the other. So this is the cluster of issues that are there very much, in the background of the material I'll be presenting today. And in addition, I should say, just by way of, a small bit of autobiographical information, one of the motivations for me writing about the topic of, the controversial issue of unconscious affect in psychoanalysis and in the ways that I do and that I will hopefully adequately explain today, was very much motivated by my experience of clinical training, both my own didactic analysis, as well as the manner in which in various forums, in clinical seminars, in case presentations and case studies, et cetera, again and again, I encountered, and bear in mind, this was at an American Psychoanalytic Association member institute, the Emory Psychoanalytic Institute, where the dominant orientations are, ego psychology, object relations theory, and various, in a way, syntheses of those two traditions as the dominant, strains represented by the faculty at the Emory Institute. And, again and again, I kept encountering clinicians who felt very comfortable invoking the idea of unconscious affect. And with my Lacanian background, me being painfully aware of, how at odds that is with at least the most familiar assertions on Lacan's part about this issue, namely his utilization of remarks that Freud makes in his papers on metapsychology from the mid-19-teens, 1915 specifically, that seem to just rule out as incoherent the very notion of unconscious affect, and to and that seem to involve Freud maintaining that the notion of unconscious affect is incoherent precisely because feelings are inherently felt and therefore are incapable of being unconscious, strictly speaking. Now, in earlier portions of self and emotional life, ones that I didn't recommend that people wade into prior to this workshop, I tried not to overburden participants with too much preparatory reading, but in some chapters prior to the ones that I suggested looking at, one of the things that I attempt to bring out there on the topic of affect in Freud, before turning to a focus on Lacan, is that Lacan's interpretation of Freud on unconscious affect is, very selective, and that if you actually look at the full sweep of Freud's pronouncements on this matter, starting, I think the earliest instance I recall him entertaining the possibility of unconscious affect, specifically with respect to guilt, is circa 1907. And then, survey everything that Freud says about this matter, up through his final years. What you discover is that, well, Freud vacillates quite a bit on this, and he sometimes entertains the possibility that somehow there can be affects that are unconscious in a certain sense. He doesn't ever fully get to grips with it as an issue, but he indicates that he is, amenable to the idea that that might be a possibility, despite this specific passage in his papers on metapsychology that Lacan always, defaults to when insisting that affects just get displaced within consciousness along the chains of signifiers that unfurl, but affect itself does not succumb to repression. Only signifiers are what Freud, deemed to be, ideational representations als Vorstellungen are to be found at the level of the unconscious, strictly speaking. And the additional oddness that's very uncharacteristic for Lacan. As I'm sure just about all of you know, Lacan never tires of saying again and again and again to his audiences, especially in the context of a seminar, go back to Freud's texts, pay attention to their devilish details, and in addition, really be attentive to the connotations and valences of Freud's original German. And following Lacan's advice, when I did this in reconstructing, Freud's, shifting, vacillating perspectives on the fraught matter of whether or not affects can be in some sense unconscious, I also discovered that there are a series of distinctions in German that show up very clearly that it seems Lacan did not track carefully himself, that in this instance, at least, he failed to follow his own advice. And in particular, here, just to simplify things a bit and not get too bogged down in the context of an oral presentation, the key thing that I would highlight here, among other of the distinctions that are very evident in Freud's German that don't always come through clearly in various translations, is that Freud in German does distinguish between affect and feeling, and that you have the German cognate affect, and then you have for feeling Empfindung. And it's really feelings that for Freud are inherently conscious. But feelings, you might say, are just for, given how Freud uses these German terms, feelings would be a species of the genus affect. And affect for Freud can also involve what he calls Affektbildungen. And these would be formations of affect that would seem to involve a combination of what we normally think of as disparate elements, and especially, the more structured constellations or configurations that involve for Freud ideational representations, Vorstellungen, or for Lacan, what he often, of course, just simply refers to with the Saussurean term signifiers. But you have, of course, these networks of ideational elements linked together, but they also carry with them a certain inherent charge that can be thought of as libidinal, or in with recourse to the neuroscientific triad of cognition, emotion, and motivation, would involve an admixture of more emotional and motivational elements that are, in a sense, inseparable from, just utterly fused with, that configuration that we could describe as an instance of Affektbildung in Freud's sense. And that sort of formation, indeed, is susceptible to repression and other intrapsychical defense mechanisms responsible for establishing a strict distinction between the unconscious on the one hand and both the preconscious and the conscious on the other. And so for Freud, indeed, to say that you could have unconscious Empfindungen, that you could have unconscious feelings, would be a contradiction in terms, and would be and is to be metapsychologically ruled out as just a priori and incoherent. But that leaves open the possibility that there are other varieties of the broader category of affect as distinct from feeling that Freud, I think, is indicating are amenable to repression and related intrapsychical mechanisms, and hence can be said to be in at least one, if not several, qualified senses unconscious. Now, Lacan himself, I think, ends up, especially in his work in the 1970s, ends up, I think, moving closer to the sort of picture I just sketched when talking about the Freudian category of Affektbildung. That, when we talk about an affective formation, this is something which, we could think of as, if it's unconscious, as a repressed or defended against configuration that, again, is a hybrid of both, structural and energetic, signifying and libidinal dimensions that are inextricably intertwined in their origins, fused from the get-go, and that, later, thanks to certain, subsequent psychical vicissitudes, over the course of one's ontogenetic life history, there, certainly can be and are occurrences in which there's then, a kind of manipulation of this content, such as to create those things that show up in the guise of splits between, say, the signifier and affect, and that allow for the possibility of affect being displaced along a chain of signifiers, as Lacan describes it. But in Lacan's later work, especially in the period of the 1970s, and here I'm thinking of when he, for example, famously in Seminar 20, discusses at length his notion of, in French, la langue, where the spacing between the definite article and the noun is collapsed, and that that of course Lacan distinguishes la langue from both langage and la langue, the latter as the mother tongue that one speaks, English, French, German, etc. In terms of la langue, as I think many of you know, for Lacan, this is a level at which you might say that signifiers operate at the level of their materiality rather than meaning, that it's the acoustic and graphic qualities of the linguistic material, not the value of them as signs, as carriers of meaning, referring to signifieds, if we're going to use the Saussurean vocabulary still. And that in addition, not only are we talking about what Lacan in his prior work, before the 1970s, already identifies as the quote unquote pure materiality of the signifier, as a matter of matter rather than meaning. There also is, for Lacan, when he talks about la langue, the notion that there's an inseparability here between the materiality of language and the jouissance saturating it, that you have a libidinally saturated and supercharged flow of signifying material in its nonsensical materiality. That is what Lacan is seeking to capture with la langue, and that of course he also has his very neologisms sound a bit like the kind of ba 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 la 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 long, the sort of playing with sounds that of course we most readily associate with babbling infants prior to them becoming competent language users in the given language that they're already swimming in without really fully registering it from birth, or even prior to birth, frankly, given Lacan's account of our thrownness into the symbolic order even before the biological moment of popping out of the womb and arriving into the cold, harsh light of our shared reality. That Lacan, with notions like la langue, and then also jouir-sens, which Fink ingeniously translates as enjoy-meant, right? The medium we normally associate with meaning as just a domain in which jouissance predominates and is concerned with matter over meaning. That these sorts of notions like la langue, jouir-sens, etc., and also of course the famous characterization of analysis in the opening session of Lacan's 25th seminar, The Time to Conclude, or Time for Concluding, I should say, where he famously baptizes analysis a quote unquote babbling practice, une pratique de bavardage. And all of these later Lacanian notions, I think they form a set of family resemblances with each other, involve him, I think, indicating that ontogenetically speaking, what is most foundational here is an original indistinction between what we later sort out into such distinctions as that between affect and signifier, between jouissance and symbolic structures, et cetera, and or energy and structure. That there are these various distinctions we subsequently draw and do rely upon heavily metapsychologically. But I think that Lacan in this later work is saying that there is this sort of level indistinction that involves an admixture of these elements, and then there are secondary processes of prying them apart or having them then flow into distinct channels where they can come to operate in a way that seems at least to involve a relative independence vis-a-vis other elements. Lacan is here, oddly enough, when in this later work he makes these sorts of moves, ending up getting, I think, quite closer to, interestingly enough, what we also see very clearly in terms of the kind of affective neuroscience that is drawn on heavily by non-Lacanian neuropsychoanalysis. And here really the principal figures would be authors such as Jaak Panksepp, Antonio Damasio, Joseph Ledoux, and then of course the sort of pioneer of Anglo-American neuropsychoanalysis, Mark Solms, and these thinkers likewise insist on to begin with when we're talking about affective neuroscience, and hence of what an examination of the central nervous system in animals such as ourselves seems to indicate about all of this. That of course one of the central assertions of these authors is that even for what Panksepp calls our blue ribbon primary color emotions. I mean, and for Panksepp as also having done his work on the basis of comparative studies between humans and non-human mammals, wants to claim that for all mammals, you have a limited number of primary emotional systems that can be precisely defined neuroanatomically and neurophysiologically. But even at this level, it's not at all a program of what we often think of when we think of any kind of brain science work, the sort of boring labor of anatomical localization. It's instead, all of them insist with equal vehemence that no, even when we talk about these basic emotions, apart from the very complicated shades of affective life peculiar to human beings, and especially to those sorts of human beings who end up on analyst couches, that there is a high degree of neuroanatomical and neurophysiological distribution of the various and sundry elements that come into play in all of these different emotional systems that Panksepp is really the sort of key discoverer of in view of his colleagues. And you have Solms, for instance, in his most recent book, The Hidden Spring, really underscore just how central, especially Panksepp's taxonomy of mammalian emotions are for Solms's version of neuropsychoanalysis. In terms of this emphasis then on distribution, where, very loosely put, you have, cognitive, emotional, and motivational elements all, operating even when we're talking about, what we would consider to be sort of, baseline primary color type emotional functioning in especially humans, that, this is invariably going to bring into play all three dimensions that are of concern to, anyone approaching human-mindedness from a neuroscientifically informed vantage point. So there is that interesting, and Lacan, I think, did not suspect this, but and of course, what he had in view in his lifetime by way of neuroscientific work is somewhat different from this material. I mean, bear in mind that most of the kind of affective neuroscientific work that myself and certain others draw on in the neuropsychoanalytic context, really dates back to the 90s and is of relatively recent vintage. And in that regard, one also has to, when reading Lacan's pronouncements on these matters, keep in mind the history of the natural scientific side of things as well as of the psychoanalytic side. And just as a further aside on this, I should say, another thing I frequently encounter when talking about this kind of material with Lacanians in particular is that, and you see this represented, for instance, with, Miller, Laurent, et cetera, these Lacanians who are very much caught up in fighting battles against what they see as a kind of natural scientific inherent tendency towards reduction, localization, a kind of crude mechanistic leveling down that will basically blot out from view so much of what is of valued and of interest and concern for not only psychoanalysts but also generally people situated more on the humanities side of things. And I've encountered again and again this worry that, well, if you, especially as a Lacanian, even try and dance at all with the neurological devil, you're going to end up losing your soul, as it were. And I certainly don't think that that is true. I think that is in part based on a misconception of, an absent consensus of a certain sort amongst natural scientific and especially neuroscientific types. But in addition, and there's the issue of the changes that have happened in those disciplines since Lacan's death in 1981. And furthermore, some of my work in certain places, part of what I tried to show is that when Lacan says things that seem to signal a vehement anti-naturalism on his part, such that he would repudiate any effort whatsoever at any kind of rapprochement of any sort with the natural sciences, and especially with any brain science, that Lacan's wariness or opposition to biologistic talk and analysis, I think, is also a narrower objection than it is often interpreted as being. I don't think that Lacan is saying, well, biology has no relevance whatsoever for, larger metapsychological issues, or is completely out of place, when talking about any psychoanalytic concept whatsoever. I think what Lacan is concerned with is not so much biology as biologism as a kind of, not scientific, but scientistic ideology, which is then used to cement in place a picture of psychoanalysis. It includes, highly normative dimensions such as, what does a quote unquote mentally healthy, well analyzed analysis look like? What should you be aiming for in terms of treatment, et cetera? And if you go back and you read the works of Lacan's arch enemies, like for instance, here I'm thinking in particular of Heinz Hartmann as, the sort of you might say the high theory mastermind of classical Anglo-American ego psychology. And that, yes, indeed, I think that, Lacan's criticisms of biologistic talk and psychoanalysis are fully warranted and make a great deal of sense when dealing with an author such as Hartmann. But I think given some of Lacan's pronouncements elsewhere, as well as just being aware of the very specific context and set of targets that Lacan has in mind when saying these certain sorts of things, he is not the vehement anti-naturalist he is so often made out to be, and would not be, I think, we cannot presume that he would be automatically opposed to the sorts of moves that myself or John is doing work very much in this vein as well, at the intersection of neuroscience and Lacanian psychoanalysis, and there are a few others besides ourselves too. I think that one can use ample evidence in Lacan's own corpus and then these contextual factors to show that no, this depiction of Lacan as an ardent foe of the relevance of natural science in any way for what psychoanalysis is concerned with, especially at the level of its metapsychology, I think is just it's one, it's wrong. And two, I think it's a kind of intellectual dead end. But perhaps we could talk about that more during the post-talk discussion. At this point, what I want to do is to zoom in connection with some of what I have just said, to zoom in particular on a rather tricky Freudian notion that involves a compound German phrase, Lacan's interpretation of this, and then how I think this is very much illustrative of some of the issues that I've begun to sketch during this first part of my presentation. So we have, of course, Freud not only speak of Vorstellungen, of what we could again translate into English as ideational representations. In certain contexts, Freud speaks of the compound German as Vorstellungsrepräsentanz. This involves two words brought together, which are very similar to each other. In a certain way, we could translate both Vorstellung and Repräsentanz as representation or as ideational representation. But Freud chooses two different, similar yet different German words, sandwiches them together. And Lacan repeatedly on various occasions points to this particular German compound word as used by Freud, and emphasizes the importance of how one interprets it. In particular, that we can say for here, I think Lacan ends up often badly misinterpreting this, and in ways that I think are very revelatory for talking about a metapsychology of affect, including the possibility of unconscious affect. But first, I just need to explain what I think Freud means by this, how Lacan reads it, and then we'll get to the implications for the metapsychology of affect. So, for Freud, as we know, there's a distinction between primary and secondary repression. And in terms of Freud's metapsychology of drive, of Trieb, right? We know from Freud's paper Drives and Their Vicissitudes, one of his mid-19-teens papers on metapsychology. We know that for Freud, all drives by metapsychological definition consist of four components: source, pressure, aim, and object, right? And here also I should confess I'm drawing on even earlier work of mine. My first book, which was my dissertation, Time Driven, spent it's both focused on this aspect of Freud's this particular way Freud has of defining drive as this in a sense coming together of these four components: source, pressure, aim, and object, and the implications involved in how we read drive in Freud along these lines. And one of the things I can say about this is, drive for Freud is not just some sort of homogeneous, energetic oomph, some sort of undiluted motivational juice, separate from everything, for instance, affective, cognitive, distinct from signifiers, et cetera. No, I mean, for Freud, as Lacan, I think, very nicely highlights in that famous set of seminar sessions from Seminar 11, the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, that the Freudian drive is more like a kind of MacGyver-esque kludge, a sort of or a Rube, sort of Rube Goldberg machine. It's a juxtaposition of heterogeneous elements that nonetheless, is itself the zero-level motivational unit of psychical life. And yet it is not something homogeneous. It is not something, that is a kind of pure energy, et cetera. It's a collage or a kind of contraption that's slapped together on the basis of disparate elements drawn from various, what we might consider to be, levels or dimensions of the psychical apparatus. And that for Freud, when he says early on in Drives and Their Vicissitudes that that the notion of Trieb is one situated on the frontier between the somatic and the psychical, that famous line of Freud's, really the psychical side, the more the side tied more to ideational representations in their interplay, or what Freud or what Lacan will try and get at with his psychoanalytic theory of the signifier. Well, that is really more on the level of the aims and objects of drives, especially the drive object. And then we also have source and pressure, as involving the somatic dimension, that includes especially certain emotional and motivational components, which, with the benefit of hindsight, we can, very easily link to aspects of the sort of affective neuroscience that someone like Mark Solms in his version of neuropsychoanalysis is drawing on. That said, when Freud talks about Vorstellung, Repräsentanz, he is talking about really this compound German word can be properly interpreted only once we take into account this characterization of drive that Freud provides us by way of metapsychological definition, and then linked to that his also well-known distinction between primary and secondary repression, right? And that with primary repression, of course, we have the original drive representatives. We have like the aim object configuration that is the initial aim object configuration invested by a source and pressure so as to form a drive per se. We have the notion that primal repression is when there is a rendering problematic, from the standpoint of the pleasure principle, impingement upon that initial aim object configuration that then, of course, forces the decathexis of that and the recathecting of some sort of suitable substitute, and if all goes well, you have successful sublimation through this process. But for Freud, of course, once that initial original repression, that Urverdrängung, takes effect, that original aim-object configuration is rendered unconscious. And I would say that would certainly qualify also as an instance of what I earlier talked about in terms of Freud's use of Affektbildung, that originally primarily repressed configuration of the aim-object circuit of drive, when it is repressed, has a kind of inherent capacity or potential to be generative of powerful affect, both indirectly through, how it shows up, as in guises at the level of the return of the repressed, or of course, if and when, say, for instance, in analytic work, it comes to light explicitly, the sort of, powerful reactivation of its affective force that would come into play in those circumstances. And so you have this primal repression of the original aim object, circuit of a drive that then comes to function as a unconscious Affektbildung that involves the potential for being generative of affect, whether indirectly via return of the repressed or directly through, being brought to light, on the other side of its repression. And when Freud talks about the original drive representative, well, that is, what he has in view when he speaks of the Représentance, that the Vorstellung Représentance, the Représentance part, that is referring to this Affektbildung, this primarily repressed configuration of aim and object in terms of Freud's metapsychology of drive. And then the Vorstellung would be the secondary elements that are associated with that primarily repressed Affektbildung, which themselves can, succumb to secondary repression. So for Freud, of course, secondary repression is where, an ideational element comes into associational connection with something already repressed, and that the already repressed, starting with the primarily repressed, or the originally repressed, the Urverdrängung dimension, that functions almost like a black hole that exerts a powerful gravitational pull that can then drag subsequent material into the unconscious through associative connection. But whether the Vorstellung that stands in for this primarily repressed Représentance succumbs to repression or is able, in say, a successful sublimation to remain partly, not completely conscious on its own, that for Freud, that is what he is getting at with the notion of the Vorstellung part of Vorstellung Représentance. And so, in my view, then you have, we might say the representative as the primarily repressed, affectively charged with the potential to be generative of Affektbildung as the aim object circuit of drive, and then you have the Vorstellung level, the ideational representation, which is associated with that primarily repressed material, but distinct from it, and it can function in a way where, for instance, it is almost like a kind of conscious delegate of the unconscious repressed, or it itself can get dragged into the unconscious and be subjected to repression proper as secondary repression, just plain old Verdrängung for Freud. Now, Lacan, the way Lacan reads this is that he essentially, to cut a very long story very short, is that he essentially, aligns this Freudian compound word with Lacan's distinction between, in terms of the mathemes that he's using, especially starting around the time of Seminar 17, with the introduction of his theory of the four discourses, with S1 and S2, with his master signifier, and then the battery of other signifiers as S2. And for Lacan, Freud's Représentance is a primarily repressed S1, a master signifier. But the way Lacan talks about it when he presents his glosses on this Freudian compound word in German is as though the Représentance that is primarily repressed is just it's strictly a signifier, or signifying material, or it would be another Freudian Vorstellung that would just so happen to be a primarily repressed one that then Freud refers to as a Représentance that then has its own as S2s Vorstellungen that stand in for it, right? Whereas I think that this and this is a misreading that I think is implicitly corrected for by the later Lacans, in the 1970s, ways of talking about la langue, bavardage, jouissance, etc., in the ways that he does, which I think are kind of retroactive and implicit corrective to this, what I think is misreading. That when Lacan basically treats Freudian representance as itself just another Vorstellung qua signifier, but an S1, given its role as the primarily repressed element that then exerts a kind of gravitational influence on all the other signifiers as S2s, that there's a failure to recognize that the representance component here is closer to a Freudian Affektbildung than it is to just a pure, cognitive, intellectual, ideational piece of content along the lines of a Vorstellung in a way that would allow Lacan to say what Freud means by Vorstellung is more or less the same as what I mean by signifier. And moreover, there's another interesting aspect to the Saussureanism that Lacan draws on here. And for most of us, I'm sure this is old hat, but I mean, if we go back to Saussure's course in general linguistics is the origin for all of structuralism. One of the things that you find is Saussure as a linguist saying, well, in addition to the utility of the structuralist framework and approach for the discipline of linguistics specifically, Saussure anticipates in a way what comes to happen with his framework in subsequent decades. He already forecasts at the start of the 20th century in the course on general linguistics that the structuralist paradigm in linguistics can also be broadened out into a kind of general semiology, where structuralists' tools and techniques, concepts and methods can be brought to bear on explanatory jurisdictions other than that covered by the field of linguistics, strictly speaking. And of course, we all know that this indeed went on to happen starting in the late 1940s with Claude Lévi-Strauss's development of structuralist anthropology. And then, of course, soon after, we have Lacan's return to Freud that gets underway in the early 1950s, and of course, is in many ways a project of cementing in place a shotgun marriage between Saussure and Freud. But if we look at the general semiological dimension of Saussurean structuralism, that what this indicates, of course, is that being a signifier isn't a matter of being a specific kind of ideational material, right? It's not that, all right, only those, say, elements that are composed of the phonemes of the language that I speak and that show up in the guise of recognizable words, etc., would count as signifiers. I mean, we know that, of course, Lévi-Strauss treats things like kinship relations and, patterns of intermarriage, within and between different human groupings as amenable to being treated as, in a way, signifiers in a structuralist sense. We know that, Barthes, for example, to cite another contemporary of Lévi-Strauss and Lacan, of course, deployed the Saussurean framework to great effect to talk about various things in our cultural landscape, including restaurant menus, photography, fashion, etc., things that we don't normally associate with natural language, strictly speaking, although, of course, none of this would be what it is without us being language using and used beings. But nonetheless, things that we think of as more than linguistic or extra linguistic prove to be amenable to, tractable in relation to structuralist concepts and approaches. And for Lacan as well, I mean, this shows up, I mean, even when Lacan says the unconscious is structured like a language, right? I mean, first of all, there's the like a part, which qualifies this, but then the word that gets translated into English as language there is specifically the French langage. And langage is not the same as une langue. Une langue would be a given natural language that is spoken by particular communities of people, so French, English, German, etc. Whereas langage would refer instead to any kind of signifier structured type network of elements, even if those elements are not linguistic, strictly speaking, that, a system of differences without positive terms, to paraphrase Saussure, and where, each element is what it is in terms of its differential relations with other such elements, which, are subject to the same, condition in turn. That if you think of it in terms of this highly abstract notion of a system of differences without positive terms, which I think is sometimes even how Lacan operates, then indeed various sorts of what we might consider to be different types of psychical or subjective content, be they linguistic or extra-linguistic, that even the latter would, insofar as it functions in signifier-like fashions for Lacan, indeed be part of what he is trying to capture when he talks about his logic of the signifier. So the differential relations between memory traces, to go back to how Freud talked about this, in the period of the late 1890s, when he was himself emerging out of the neurosciences and was beginning to lay the foundations of what became psychoanalysis proper. Freud's notion of the dynamics between, for instance, memory traces, as he talks about it in the Fleece correspondence, for example, indicates that things like episodic memories, sensory perceptual traces retained in the mental apparatus, etc., that these elements also can function as signifiers in terms of how they establish mutually defining associative relations and interconnections with each other, and that this sort of dynamic is indeed capturable in structuralist terms for Lacan, and that langage for him is, in the fact he doesn't say the unconscious is structured like une langue, like a natural language such as English, French, German, etc., is him, I think, conveying this point in a way that's often misunderstood. Now, the key move that I want to make is to say that this, that Lacan's broadening of Saussurean structuralism, in line with Saussure's vision of a kind of general semiological carrying forward of the work he had done within the field of linguistics, can also be applied to talking about affects, right? Because, and this would allow to condense quite a bit, going from the standard sense of an opposition between affect and signifier, where it's a matter of affect versus signifier, we go to affect as signifier, which would be the way in which of course even different affective components come to color each other by virtue of how they are differentially related with one another in the ever-changing systemic networks of the psyche as it continues to unfurl itself over the course of ontogenetic life history. Here I think that we have to realize that that essential to for Freud, the very identity of primarily repressed material as what it is, in terms of what I was presenting a few minutes ago by way of what I think Freud really is getting at with this idea of Vorstellung, Repräsentanz, that the Repräsentanz, the primarily repressed Affektbildung, as that part of a drive circuit that initially succumbs to repression, and specifically Urverdrängung, primal repression, that is both and neither nor in terms of the affect signifier distinction, and that moreover, the affective valence of and influence of that primarily repressed element itself comes to be inflected by the subsequent developments at the level of Vorstellungen in terms of secondary repression, sublimations, etc., as these various and sundry drive vicissitudes that Freud identifies. Now, a few other points, and I realize I'm getting close to the hour, a stopping point. And so there's a way that I can illustrate some of this too, in terms of the topic of anxiety. And this is another kind of important component, and this gets at another very important component of that content of self and emotional life that I asked participants, or not asked, I encouraged interested participants to look at ahead of time. Now, one of the you might say even really the guiding agenda for me in my contributions to this book I co-authored with Malibu was really to find a way to not only bring Lacan and the neurosciences together, but to do so in a way that addresses this vexed issue of unconscious affect, and moreover to deal with the apparent divide between, on the one hand, non-Lacanian analysts who seem, in not always, but certainly, I think in general, are much more comfortable entertaining the idea of unconscious affect, versus that Lacan who at certain moments just emphatically denies that as inherently oxymoronic, a contradiction in terms, etc. And to, in a way, do justice to, I think, what not just non-Lacanian analysts, but Freud himself was aware of when Freud felt tempted to acknowledge the existence of unconscious affect, not just displaced affect, but unconscious affect. But to do it in a way that I think does take seriously some of Lacan's sometimes justified criticisms of the way that unconscious affect is talked about in by other analysts or in other analytic orientations. And what I ultimately push towards is this notion of what I label misfelt feeling as, really, what I think is the most plausible version of unconscious affect that one could extract from, an examination of Freud, Lacan, post-Freudian, non-Lacanian analytic currents, and the affective neuroscientific resources that, following Solms, I too am drawing on in this work that I'm presenting a bit of a gloss of, or a kind of overview of here this afternoon, I should say. It's a little earlier in the day for me still. All right, so we know that both Freud and Lacan, when we're talking about affect, place a great degree of importance on one affect in particular, namely anxiety. And I would also say here as an aside, the affect, though, interestingly, that most prompts Freud to be willing to soften that what seems like that very hard exclusionary line on unconscious affect that he sounds in his metapsychology papers and that Lacan relies on, that in the other places where, from 1907 through the end of his career, Freud talks about unconscious affect as, strangely, it's almost always in connection with guilt. But at the same time, we know that for Freud, anxiety is enormously important. And Lacan, and Lacan too, when defending himself against critics, psychoanalytic or non-psychoanalytic, who say, "Oh, you ignore affect. This is a dry, hyper-intellectualized, almost kind of like obsessional, neurotic version of analysis that drains off, all of this emotional and motivational content that lends this material its richness and its charge." That Lacan, routinely will say, "Look, I devoted my entire seminar in 1962 to 1963 to the topic of anxiety. I don't ignore affect." Now, of course, the retort there would be for many, well, one academic year out of 27 isn't all that much for psychoanalysts to spend talking about affect, but, not wading into those sorts of debates that I think are somewhat more superficial. I think that there is something very important about Freud's and Lacan's mutual identification, though, of anxiety as being especially important or emblematic when it comes to the status of affect in psychoanalysis and in its both clinical and theoretical. And to bring out what I mean by misfelt feeling and how this notion of misfelt feeling, I think, enables one to retain a sense to the idea of unconscious affect without running afoul of some of the, I think, not entirely unjustified objections to at least how some people might talk about unconscious affect. I think anxiety is especially useful. And, to begin with, we could say that, with anxiety, anxiety is, in a way, I think, is for both Freud and Lacan, similar to how Marx talks about money as a universal equivalent. It's sort of the affect into which all other affects can, in a way, be translated, and translated, or we might also say mistranslated, by virtue of how those other affects are interfered with by various and sundry psychical defense mechanisms. And that you could say that, you of course have the Freud of the metapsychology papers and the Lacan appealing to him, who seem to say, all right, well, when repression occurs, repression is capable of rendering ideational material unconscious, but the affect attached to that ideational material, when repression befalls that material, the affect, instead of itself also being repressed, just gets displaced. It drifts or goes elsewhere, as Lacan sometimes says. And it's just, displaced along a series of substitute representations as these other signifiers, these S2s, that it's, shunted along. We might say that at the same time, what this description, I think, doesn't do justice to is that, although the affect is not rendered completely unconscious in terms of we stop feeling certain feelings when this happens, what I think occurs instead is that we come to misfeel those repressed feelings. They still show up, but they show up through a glass darkly and highly distorted, and often as anxiety. And I think that part of the reason for that, and this is a bit of a speculation on my part, but one based on, especially the kind of affective neuroscientific work that's so central to the Solms et al. Camp, is that, of course, like Solms repeatedly stresses about, Panksepp's taxonomy of mammalian, fundamental emotions, and and then in humans, the various strange permutations that result from these based on, the interplay of other aspects that are distinct of our humanity with our mammalian neurocircuitry. That that there is a way in which the affect, as the affect that it is, when it as part of an Affektbildung is repressed, it then shows up in the guise of, now, because especially the ideational components it's attached to are rendered unconscious, it will show up in a distorted way as excitement, but perhaps unspecified excitement. And of course, the free-floating or indefinite character of anxiety is dear to both Freud and, among others, Heidegger. But without getting distracted along those lines, Solms, for instance, when talking about all of the fundamental mammalian emotions a la Panksepp, says they all involve arousal. They all involve this idea of excitation and of heightened activity, of even, we might say, agitation. And so you might say that there's a tendency for the affective side of certain Affektbildungen, which are really what succumb to primal repression and all of its aftermath, that this will then show up. It will still be felt, but it won't be felt as, say, the love, hate, etc., that it originally was. Or sexual excitation. It will now show up instead as just excitation, but excitation which we can't even self-interpret properly, and that we can then end up, and that we will tend to experience just as excitement in its state of just free-floating agitation, discomfort, unsettlement, etc. And that this would be, since all of the different emotions involve arousal, that the arousal will continue to be felt, but we will then misfeel those emotions, because in feeling the arousal without the accompanying cognitive material that the arousal was originally bound up with, it will tend to show up as what I call misfelt feeling. And so it's to say, yes, on the one hand, the idea of unfelt feeling, right, of an Empfindung in Freud's sense as unfelt is incoherent, because a feeling in that sense is inherently felt, hence conscious. But so it's not that. But on the other hand, it's then not the notion that what exists at the level of the unconscious is simply, this ideational material, be it, linguistic, or even if it's extra linguistic, of a kind of cognitive representational nature, and that everything affective is just simply what remains what it is, and then is just, kicked down the road of other signifiers within the sphere of consciousness. No, it's that, a potential for feeling very specific affective valences subsists at the level of the unconscious, and the excitation of the affective part of the Affektbildung, it shows up in consciousness, but not as what it originally was, but now distorted through the mediation or interference of the subsequent psychical defense mechanisms, as Freud describes them, now showing up in the guise of an excitement, which sometimes just as sheer arousal, but without the corresponding spontaneous cognitive self-interpretations that might be appropriate to it, it will show up in the guise of them like anxiety, free-floating guilt, etc. And this is what I think I'm able to back up as I think a plausible account of much of what analysis wants to get at with the idea of unconscious affect. whether you agree it exists or not, that much of the subtlety of handling affect and its relationship to the unconscious and to defense mechanisms in psychoanalysis, that there's a way to back up this sort of picture using a combination indeed of not just Freud but Freud and Lacan with what we have access to on the neuropsychoanalytic and neurobiological side of things.